I'll just tell you about my journey into this space, which is,
Tell us your
I
journey, man.
tell us
Yeah.
my journey.
Organized money.
So a major scam was just uncovered in DC. I think it was last month, and it's something that kind of went viral online, but didn't get a lot of attention in the mainstream press. It's about why food prices went up, and there's a lot of really interesting politics here. So, do you want to explain? You want to explain what happened? Because I think this is an important thing.
Sure. Sure. So there was a lawsuit that was filed at the tail end of the Biden administration, and it was a lawsuit against Pepsi. And it was for violations of this thing called the Robinson-Patman Act, which is an anti-price discrimination law. And it was a little hard to understand what it was alleging because a lot of it was redacted. But essentially, Pepsi was giving lower prices on its supplies, wholesale prices, to some large big box store actor. It wasn't described in the complaint initially. And they were raising prices to competitors to that big box store. They were giving preferential treatment to one supplier, one retailer over everybody else, which means everybody else using other retailers were paying higher prices. And this wasn't because of supply and demand. This wasn't because of any kind of natural force in the economy. It was just this contractual relationship between Pepsi and one big supplier. The problem was we didn't know a whole lot about it because it was redacted. And then very quickly, when Donald Trump became president and Andrew Ferguson became the head of the FTC, they dropped the case. And they dropped the case before it could be released to the public. And that's where our guest today comes in. Our guest is Stacy Mitchell. She is the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and they filed an injunction to have the full case redacted and released to the public.
I
And
mean,
after
unredacted.
I'm
You said
sorry. So let me do it again. So they filed a lawsuit to have the full case unredacted and released to the public. And the judge agreed after a hearing and some legal matters. And now we know who that large big box supplier that was getting this preferential treatment from Pepsi was. Turns out it was Walmart.
right. So what happened here is the Lena Khan FTC found what is this, allegedly a conspiracy between Walmart and Pepsi to inflate food prices across the economy. And then the Trump administration tried to bury it, and a plucky nonprofit filed a case, a long shot case, and the judge agreed. And so now we know what happened, and we have this plucky nonprofit leader to talk to us about it. So here we are, Organized Money.
All right, Stacy Mitchell, thank you for being on Organized Money.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, I'm surprised it took so long. You are, I think, maybe the biggest public foe of Walmart in the U.S., and you have been for years. And I just want to know what you have against such a great American company.
The destruction of a
Yeah,
lot
we
of
just
our countryside, our economy, our way of life.
oh yeah.
Just that.
There
Other than that,
we go, communist.
have you ever heard from anyone
Um,
inside the company? Like whether it was positive or negative, you ever heard from anybody like because you've been at this for a while.
No, I mean, we sometimes sort of hear, I guess mainly through journalists, kind of how they're responding. We get sort of glimpses at the fact that they read our research and, what they think about it. They, have a very, they try to discredit us, as you would imagine. So we hear about that through third parties, but never had any contact.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of curious before we get into the meat of the interview, because I think that the exposure here, and you're really responsible for it, which is very exciting. But it is kind of a weird thing to be so obsessively focused on pricing. How did you get into this work? I mean, what drove you? You're not an economist, right? Which I say as a compliment. What got you into the work?
Yeah, I have always, I think, going back to being like, I don't know, a teenager in college, sort of concerned about people having control over the places that they live and concerned about, sort of the ways in which I think at that time I conceptualized it as like really the hollowing out of communities. And after when I was in college, I studied history, American history, like labor movement, environmental movement, really around trying to understand the economy from a different lens. Like I went to an economics class and was there for like one day and left because I was like, oh, this is not actually the way into what I'm trying to understand. And I was really interested.
So that was labor and environment, but on the other side
Yeah, in
of
history
the issue.
classes. Yeah, exactly. In the real side of the issues, right? And trying to understand like how does change happen? How do people make change happen? Like how do ideas work and all that sort of thing. And then when I got out of school, like I worked in the labor movement a little bit, but I wasn't really suited to just being kind of an activist. And there were issues I had with the labor movement. I tried a sort of experimented with an academic kind of approach, and that was too disconnected from reality. And then I just happened to get a job at ILSR. Like I read about this organization and was really taken with it. I was in my 20s. And got a job as a research assistant. And one of the first things, I was tasked with like studying a lot of different things, but one of the first things I was tasked with studying with was at the time, and this was in the late 1990s, was Walmart was growing all across the country, and it was a sort of question of like, is this good or bad? Like, what are the implications? Like, go look at this thing. And as I started looking at it and talking to people, it was like, this is incredibly destructive. And we started writing about it. And at that time, there was no place, if you were like a community who wanted to stop a Walmart store, there was no place really you could turn to for help. And so we just got like this huge response because people were looking for that and trying to figure out how to stop this thing on the ground.
Yeah, one of the things
I remember
that... Go ahead. Go ahead, man.
Well, yeah, I just want to say I remember in 2003, and I'll let you go after this date, but I remember 2003, which was not the 90s, but pretty close. Jason Furman's paper,
Yeah.
The Progressive Case for Walmart, and Jason later became the head economic advisor for Obama, just to give a framework for kind of what you were up against to the listeners. There was this strong view that Walmart moving, into different towns was very progressive. Like it was a good thing for the consumer. So anyway, I also want to get that in there.
Yeah, that
Furman took
persisted.
that offline.
It's only recently, and thanks to the anti-monopoly movement, that there's been any like sort of sense on, among progressives that this was maybe bad. I mean, that idea persisted so long, and Furman's view was very much mainstream of progressive or democratic thinking at the time.
Yeah.
And, this sense that, this was a, progressive success story, lower prices for people. And we were really, we were sort of like Luddites at the table to the extent we were even at any tables at that time, which we weren't. And people sort of, the only critique that you really found was like Walmart should pay higher wages. But once it does that, we're fine with Walmart. Like that was the feeling among progressives.
Yeah, like I remember a movie that Robert Greenwald and his Brave New Films people put out called Walmart, the High Cost of Low Prices, almost accepting the argument, like accepting the low price part of the argument.
What is actually
right?
wrong? Well, so that's true, but like what is wrong with Walmart? I mean, if you pay higher wages, then give us the sort of the full-throated critique.
Yeah, I mean, Walmart has and is consolidating the economy. Its goal is to control the entire consumer goods sector. And so you control it as a gatekeeper by dominating retail. And then that gives you power up the supply chain. You control producers and all the way, we can go all the way back to like farmers. If Walmart decides there's a different cut of beef that is going to be the right cut of beef, now we're growing, different kinds of cattle, like that is the kind of way that their power works up the supply chain. And it's a very centralized, like we're going to centralize control over the economy and sort of dictate from Bentonville, Arkansas, how everything works. And in the process of doing that, how Walmart took over was very much recognizing the huge shift that had happened in antitrust enforcement. And taking advantage of the ability to engage in predatory pricing and price discrimination. So essentially it went into these communities and would sell goods at a loss, particularly the goods that were sold by other merchants within that community. Those often independent retailers couldn't survive because they had to pay their bills at the end of the month. They didn't have like a cash source to operate at a loss past a very short period of time. So they would go out of business and then Walmart would raise prices. And the other thing it did was go to suppliers and say, you're going to give us better deals and you're going to charge our competitor down the street higher prices. And those two tactics would not have been possible if Walmart had come along any earlier in our history. Its rise very much absolutely aligns with that shift in policy that began in the 80s. And so along with that, you saw this complete collapse. We have seen, a complete collapse in independent businesses, particularly the kind of businesses that line our neighborhoods and our towns. And with that, a loss of like community cohesion, a sense of connection to our neighbors. And that had all kinds of implications in terms of democracy, essentially, like the way that we relate to one another has been very much undermined by the fact that we've gone to this economic system where you have an absentee-owned company that sits in your town and extracts wealth, and the businesses that used to circulate money and create spaces for people to interact and who had a vested interest in the well-being of the community are gone. And I think that gets you to where we are today in so many ways.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the predatory pricing and the laws that are supposed to be used to enforce that in a second. But one of the more recent papers you wrote at ILSR was about Walmart's share of the grocery market. In other words, how this strategy led to success. Maybe people who are in cities where Walmart isn't as big, of force, don't really realize this. But can you tell us about that research?
Yeah, I mean, there are over 200 metropolitan and micropolitan areas. So micropolitan areas are like metropolitan areas, except that the central city is a little smaller. Almost all Americans live in either a metropolitan or a micropolitan area. But there are over 200 of those places where Walmart has more than 50% market share of groceries.
Wow.
And there are, I believe, I haven't looked at that research in a while, I believe it was over 40 of those places where Walmart had more than 70% market share. And functionally, if you think for a minute about what that means, like people are not going to drive to the other side of the metro to do their grocery shopping. So for a lot of people in those regions, they really only have one choice, which is Walmart, because that's the only store that's within any reasonable distance of where they live. Walmart is so dominant. It often gets compared to A&P, the big grocery chain back in the earlier part of the 20th century. But A&P was, never had Walmart's share. I mean, Walmart is 1/4 of all grocery sales. One out of every $4 that Americans spend on groceries goes through Walmart. It's just enormously powerful. And that's just talking about groceries. You start to add on, all of the other products, consumer electronics, health and beauty, sort of all the kinds of things, clothing, et cetera, they are just enormous. Walmart's physical footprint in the US, its stores, is so big that every single American, every man, woman, and child could get inside a Walmart store at the same time. Yeah.
That's amazing.
There's all sorts of implications of I read a study that where there's a Walmart opens, like obesity rates increase, and there's all these really interesting aspects of this company. It does remind me of a story that Kurt Cobain told about how, and this was in the 90s, of Nirvana, right? One of the greatest songwriters of all time. And he told a story about explicit lyrics and how I think he didn't, other Nirvana band members didn't like that Walmart was more aggressive about explicit lyrics. But he said, look, one of the only places I could get music was Walmart when I was a kid. So it's important to him that kids like him are able to sell from Walmart. And that was kind of I had never heard that before, where it's this lifeline to kind of almost anything for so many people. But let's get to the pricing, right? Because, the high cost of low prices, there is this perception that Walmart is the low price leader in America, and that it does foster low prices. You heard that with the Biden administration. You hear that with the Trump administration, with a lot of, but what your organization uncovered was one of the first federal enforcement of the Robinson-Patman Act after decades of dormancy. And this scheme, and I use the term Robinson-Patman, which maybe not everybody knows, but this scheme shows that it isn't necessarily that Walmart is lowering prices. So what happened? What did your organization expose? What did the FTC bring? And then why was this law, the Robinson-Patman Act, why did it stop getting enforced? And then why were these cases so important?
Yeah,
I think that's a bundle of questions, but it's all kind of part of the same story.
Yeah, well, I'll just briefly say what the Robinson-Patman Act is and then sort of briefly touch on the case and what was uncovered, and then maybe we can dig into each of those things. The Robinson-Patman Act was passed, as you know, in the 1930s, and it was to address at that time what was kind of a new monopoly problem. Americans over the years have enacted new antitrust laws in order to address new problems, and this was came along in that sort of vein. And the problem that arose then was that we started to have these large national chains led by A&P, the grocer, and A&P at that time was expanding all over the place, rapidly growing market share, and putting a lot of competing often independent grocers out of business along the way. And there were investigations done by the FTC and by Congress that found that A&P was doing that not by being a better competitor, but instead it had figured out that it could use the supply chain to knock other retailers out of business. And so essentially it was going to suppliers and saying, you're going to give us a better deal and you're going to raise prices to these competitors that we are facing in these markets that we're expanding in. Those other grocers, independent grocers, they're going to have to raise their prices to consumers because they're now having to pay more to the supplier for their goods. Consumers are going to say, I don't really want to pay this much. They're going to go down the street to the new A&P, and that's how A&P is growing this rapidly and putting everybody else out of business. That's what the investigation found. And so the Robinson-Patman Act says that as a supplier, you can't offer a better price to a large retailer than you're offering to other retailers. And it has other provisions, but that's the essential nature of it, that everybody gets the same terms to buy on. We enforced that law for decades, and it's really interesting to go look back at that period in the grocery industry in the U.S. Like, it's hard not to be really envious of what it looked like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and we can sort of unpack that. But we had a really competitive grocery sector where almost anywhere you lived, whether you lived in a small town or a low-income neighborhood, you not only had a grocery store, you often had several grocery stores. And most people had the choice between an independent or a chain. I mean, it was a time with just a lot of diversity in the marketplace. But in the 70s, Matt, you've written about this a lot and probably know more about it than I do, but the sort of confusion that came along in terms of where the economy was, people began to have this idea, partly in response to inflation, that getting rid of our antitrust laws and easing up on antitrust would be good for consumers. And in particular, this argument was made that we should allow big retailers to flex their power over suppliers, that will lead to lower prices for consumers. And so a decision was made in the Reagan administration to stop enforcing the Robinson-Patman Act. And it really has not been enforced up until the Biden administration, so for many, many decades. The Biden administration brought two cases, and the one that we're going to talk about today is a case that they brought against Pepsi for essentially conspiring with Walmart to raise prices on Pepsi products across the board at other retailers in order to ensure that Walmart always had the lowest price and that Walmart could then dominate. And there's a lot of things, I have a lot of things to say about like what this case or the evidence in this complaint means. But one of the things that it really illustrates is that lack of Robinson-Patman enforcement is actually raising prices, not lowering them. And that we are living in this kind of, I don't know how to describe it exactly, this scenario where the effect of Walmart has been to lift prices overall. Now, it still has the lowest price often, but its existence and the power it exerts is raising prices overall. And so there's this like paradox where people think, well, the best price is Walmart. But in fact, we're all paying more, both those of us who shop at Walmart and those of us who don't shop at Walmart, because of Walmart.
Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button so that more people can get exposed to organized money. Really appreciate it.
Now, when this case came out, I remember that it was a case against Pepsi, as you say, and we had to sort of guess that Walmart was the conspirator in this case. And because the reason was that it was heavily redacted for the public. And I understand this is normal, that there's sort of a negotiation that takes place between the FTC and the company and the judge about what can be disclosed and not violate trade secrets or whatever. But in this case, the FTC leadership changed hands, and the case was dropped before those disclosures were finalized. So we just had to sort of guess, what was actually going on here. So my question is, why was it important to you to get this information out to the public, even if this case was no longer active?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the FTC changed hands. The Trump FTC took over, and the current chair of the FTC, Andrew Ferguson, moved to dismiss this case or step back, drop this case. I believe it was in May, and he did so right before there were to be these proceedings that would go through the normal process of unsealing most of what was there. And so, at the time he said, well, there's nothing to see here. There's no evidence. This is just a lark. There's no evidence in this complaint, and therefore we're going to drop it, but we're going to do it right before it actually becomes unsealed. So, I'm not going to show you the receipts on the no evidence. I'm just going to assert that that's the case. And this is one of the most.
He was much nastier than that. I don't want to. I mean, he was very mean about it. He said, "This is partisan. This is dishonest, disaster.
Right.
Ruining staff morale." And I mean, he was, attacking Lena Khan, and then Mark Metter, who was the other commissioner, who was considered somewhat populist, but he said, we're just. People would say, "What's going on?" With
cleaning up.
He was like, "We're cleaning up Lena Khan's mess." I mean, this was weird. It was weird.
And it was easy for them. It was easy for them to do that because there was nothing anyone else could point to say, actually, you're lying, because here's the complaint here, because the complaint was a bunch of black bars.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. I'm being way too nice in describing what he did.
That's what we do on the show.
My role is to be I'm the heavy.
We tell people not to be so nice on this show. That's right.
I mean, here's what Ferguson said. This is when he dissented, when the case was voted on. We have no evidence of disparate treatment, none. I have seen no evidence that Pepsi denied to any firm the promotions or services it offered to the big box store. I mean, he just categorically denies that there's any evidence whatsoever. And then his dissent is like 7 or 8 pages long, and he's mostly up on a high horse the entire time, pointing fingers at Lena Khan and at the commission and saying, this is just like a partisan, thing. There's no evidence. This is just a lark. This is ridiculous. You're using, and he just goes on and on and on and on. And you have to look back at that moment, because this was in January, and it's like, okay, he obviously knows that the FTC is going to change hands. He maybe even knows that he's going to be named chair, right? And therefore, he knows that he's going to drop this case, and he's going to do it before anyone can actually see the evidence, and therefore he can get away with just this kind of ridiculous, commentary about how there's no evidence, and this is just a witch hunt that's unjustified. Yeah, totally.
Can I just read? I want to read a little bit from the dissent. This isn't the dissent on the Pepsi. This is a different Robinson Patman case, but it's like the same vibe, where he says. The Democratic commissioners will not suffer the consequences of this power grab. The commission staff and the American people will. Like Tom and Daisy Buchanan, the Democratic commissioners, on the eve of their loss of power, carelessly smash up the commission, our staff, and our public credibility before retreating into the minority and leaving others to clean up their mess. I dissent. Such a pompous guy.
Right.
Who analogizes a price discrimination case to the Great Gatsby? Sorry. Loser.
Yeah. So okay.
It is a weird combination of both incredible cowardliness and craven ambition. It's, yeah.
And total snobbishness. So what was the argument you made to the judge to say this is in the public interest. We need to know what was alleged here.
Yeah, I mean, the argument is that, these kinds of complaints are, things that are filed in court are public as a general matter. And just because we didn't get to the unsealing process before the FTC dismissed it, the public had an absolute right to know. And there are different bases, the sort of legal arguments that go around that. Some of it has to do with the fact that, as citizens, we need to be able to monitor like what agencies are doing, how judges and courts are responding to what they're doing. And if you can't see the things that are filed, you can't actually monitor that. And then I think specific to this case, this was, there was one sort of, the Biden FTC, the Lena Khan FTC filed 2 Robinson-Patman cases. This was in some respects, you could say the more significant of the 2 because it dealt, we suspected, with Walmart and with grocery prices. And so the idea that this would be shoved aside and no one would actually get to see what was in there at a time when grocery prices are soaring, that this is a central issue in our politics, when the role of antitrust is really key to that, the idea that this would just be swept under the rug and no one would get to see this complaint, seemed to really be against the public interest.
So what's actually in the complaint? What did you find?
Yeah, so you see a lot of evidence. There's a lot of internal company emails and meetings and documents and so on. And what it shows is that Pepsi, and Pepsi is a very large supplier. They control a lot of, they control a lot of they control a lot of drink brands beyond soda. So, I mean, they also have Mountain Dew and Dr. Pepper, but they Aquafina and Bubbly and their Gatorade and their Tropicana. So, when you think about Pepsi, it's not just soda. It's a whole bunch of different.
And it's Frito-Lay. It's snacks too. Yeah.
Yeah. This complaint, I think, just dealt with the beverage side of their business, but the beverage side of their business is huge. What you see is that Pepsi is working very hard to ensure that Walmart stays dominant, that Pepsi is using both special dollars that they're giving to Walmart through promotional allowances and other kinds of effectively discounts, and that they are actively raising prices and denying promotional discounts to other retailers when those retailers price below Walmart. So Pepsi is out there. And according to the complaint, this has been going on for more than a decade and even continues when the complaint was filed. Pepsi is out there monitoring all of these other grocery retailers. And if one of them drops its prices on Pepsi products below Walmart, Pepsi calls those offenders. That's its term for them. And then you see, there's committees swing into action. There's this thing called a pricing council within Pepsi. At one point we see in the evidence, they swing into action because all across these regions in the Southeast, their monitors have discovered that Walmart isn't always that other retailers are actually selling Pepsi for less. And this is a huge problem. So the pricing council,
can't have
which is
that.
Senior vice presidents, the whole bit, they swing into action and they come up with this plan that involves lowering prices to Walmart and raising prices to other people in order to correct that. And they call this the price gap. So Walmart's price gap with other retailers. So there's all this language and activity going on inside Pepsi. And what you realize is that, for Pepsi, the arrangement is, and this is the conspiratorial part of it, is essentially, the arrangement is that if Pepsi ensures that Walmart gets to dominate in retail, you keep Walmart the king of its domain, then Walmart will allow Pepsi to be the king of its domain, meaning Pepsi can dominate beverage sales as long as it keeps Walmart dominant in retail. And that's the arrangement, and that's sort of the conspiratorial nature of this.
I love that it's one thing that my takeaway is that the real conspiracies that rule the world are insanely dorky. Like the pricing committee swings into action. Right. It's not like a dude with a six-pack who wears spandex. It's some dork
Rather than Superman, it's a committee of senior vice presidents and middle
Yeah,
managers.
SVPs
Yeah.
on LinkedIn. I figured out
Yeah.
the real predators are on LinkedIn. That's the worst social media. Anyway,
Yeah.
this isn't this is so like how does this help Pepsi? I mean, this isn't just about special deals to Walmart. There's there's there are other aspects to it as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Pepsi gets a lot out of this arrangement. Like they get, Walmart gives them these huge displays. Like, if you're walking down the aisle and there's one of those like square, piles of merchandise, like Pepsi is getting those. It's getting the end caps. It's getting all of this stuff within Walmart stores. So effectively, Walmart is like making sure that Pepsi gets to be the top dog in its category. And in exchange for keeping Walmart the top dog. And so if you step back for a minute and you think about, well, what does this connect to? Well, I mean, I guess first of all, like I think it's safe to assume that Pepsi is not the only major supplier that Walmart has this arrangement with. Like this is probably not a one-off. So we can think about General Mills, Procter and Gamble, ConAgra, Tyson, all of these big.
Well, apparently Post and Walmart did this with there was Snoop Dogg's tried to make cereal.
Yeah.
And Post and Walmart pretended to cut a deal with him and then excluded his cereal from the shelf. So we know I mean, yes, it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
That's a great example. And also there's a private case that involves Energizer, which is the same story,
yeah.
the battery,
That's
battery
right.
company, where again, like this partnership with Walmart. And so if you think about like, and this is very true in food, like we all know, you walk down the aisles at the supermarket and you see all these different brands, but they're owned by just a handful of companies. Like it's so consolidated. And, food should be a thing that like a new startup could break into, especially given like the price hikes that we've seen these major food suppliers, implement in the last few years. But why is it that other companies can't break in? Well, they can't break in because Walmart's holding shelf space for Pepsi in exchange for Pepsi ensuring that Walmart doesn't face any real competition. And
Actually,
so,
Mr. Beast complained about this. He was trying to get
Yes, he did.
Mr. Beast about trying to get chocolate bars on the shelf, and he couldn't get chocolate bars on Walmart shelf until it was so popular. There was so much demand that he was. And anyway,
yeah.
Now we're going through a series of guests that we've tried to get on the show. Anyway,
I didn't try to get Mr. Beast. He wouldn't.
Snoop, by the way, come on.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, I mean, what I think is interesting about this to me is how this ultimately raises the price level across the sector. So, Walmart, obviously, you said they're massive. They have a quarter of the grocery market, but that means 75% of customers go elsewhere. And the impact is raising prices on the majority of those customers if this price gap needs to be maintained. And then I imagine also eventually, as competition thins out, this also affects Walmart shoppers as well, because even if it's the lowest price, it can be relatively higher, right? So is that dynamic really just across the board raising prices?
I think so. I think that's absolutely right. That even Walmart shoppers are probably paying elevated prices because the whole price floor has been lifted up by this scheme. At the end of the day, Walmart doesn't actually care if the price is low in absolute terms. The only thing they care about is that their price is lower than the other guy. And so as long as that's sustained, they're actually kind of happy if prices go up a bit, right? They get to make they get to make more. And this is facilitated. I mean, there is a direct line between lack of Robinson-Patman enforcement and the price hikes that we've seen. As the Prospect has done all this great reporting, Groundwork Collaborative over the last few years on how these companies like, Pepsi, General Mills, et cetera, are on earnings calls bragging about raising prices and not losing customers because they don't face enough competition at this point. And so, this is all related to the failure to enforce this law.
So let me do a little pushback. Okay. So there's a group of 70-plus-year-old annoying antitrust experts like Herb Havenkamp. A friend of mine calls them the prostate brigade. And they have been the people who have been saying I like that you like want to laugh.
You're allowed to laugh.
Yeah, it was really, I laughed for a good solid 60 seconds after she made that joke. But anyway, so Havenkamp and the rest of that group, what they would say is if you enforce Robinson Patman, a company like Walmart will just vertically integrate and will do its own store brands for a lower price. So it won't matter. In fact, it could make things worse. And you do see Walmart going into meat packing, making its own milk, and so on and so forth. How do you respond to that?
I mean, it's just like it's sort of ridiculous because basically it's like, well, if we don't enforce this law, then they're going to violate other laws that we're also not enforcing. Like that's essentially the argument that they're making. I mean, it's like, yeah, we shouldn't have vertical integration. Walmart should not be processing milk because there's a whole host of problems with that. We see this with the merger thing. I mean, the Kroger Albertsons proposed merger
Right.
was driven entirely by like we want to have as much buyer power as Walmart. We want to have the same level of muscle over suppliers to work this same conspiracy deal ourselves.
Right.
That was
Yeah,
what was
I
drove that
remember an
merger.
Albertsons executive saying we have to merge just to compete. And so there
Right.
is this kind of dynamic where it actually is driving consolidation, just the ability to play these price games and actually the need to play the price games.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
The theory is we cannot have a price gap. We
Right.
we have to get the price gap ourselves.
Right. Right. And they have it. It's just they have buyer power too. It's just not quite as aggressive as Walmart's, right? So yeah,
Right.
it's a ridiculous argument to say like, oh yeah, if we address this problem, we're going to have these other problems that we should also enforce against. I will say like what when I went back, was it, I think it was last summer, and did this just like really deep dive, or maybe it was the year before. Anyway, I'll start again. I went back at one point and did this like really deep dive on the history of the grocery industry, in the 20th century, and did a lot of looking at like corporate records for the major grocery chains in the sort of what they were up to internally in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, and really it was like I realized how much like lack of Robinson Patman enforcement actually drove the entire merger spree that we see in supermarket chains in the 90s and early 2000s. It's entirely about trying to attain buyer power. And in fact, to the point of like other very obvious kind of like corporate strategies and imperatives are set aside because buyer power has become such an overwhelming driver of the whole system. So this, like, back to the sort of Hovenkamp thing, RPA is driving this whole set of problems in our food system. And unless we deal with that, I don't think we can really deal with the rest of them.
And the interesting thing is, and you touched on this before, is this dynamic where you have a leading food supplier and a leading retailer basically agreeing to keep each other on top, right? This monopoly begets monopoly kind of dynamic to this. And it's almost that what Walmart has to give Pepsi is dominance. Like they have really nothing else that they can give them other than we're going to make you impenetrable in terms of market share and everything. That's I think, we see this dynamic in other parts of the economy too, I think. And it just seems really dangerous that we have this tendency to monopoly, and then also this tendency of the people on the top of the ladder to pull up other people on the top of the ladder and push everyone else down.
Just to make an observation, one of the things that I think is really strange about soft drinks, and you can see the legal framework, is that when you go to a restaurant, you can order a bunch of different types of beer, but you order Coke or Pepsi, right? And so that you can just see the distribution power and legal framework just differs right then and there, where there's competition in one area, in one set of drinks, and not competition in another set of drinks. I mean, I'm kind of oversimplifying, but I guess one, and it is weird because, Pepsi makes sugared water, right? And you would think there could be competition to make cheaper sugared water, but there isn't, and this kind of explains why, and that there's pricing discipline and everything. There's one other aspect to this that I think is really interesting and important, and something that we did a podcast with a distributor to independent grocery stores, multi-billion-dollar distributor. But one of the things he talked about was shortages and the post-COVID moment, and not just shortages in things you would expect, but shortages kind of like, we just won't sell you the things that you need. We're going to sell them to Walmart. But they know the FTC did a report on what happened after the post-COVID era. The post-COVID moment of just inflation and shortages and all that, it really drove, I think still drives today, the psychology of what's happening with pricing. But can you talk a little bit about how Walmart uses its buying power or used its buying power, what we found out about it, what you know about it, what we don't know about it in this moment?
Yeah. So as COVID started and there were beginning to be shortages and manufacturers, suppliers often couldn't supply more than, 70-80% of the demand. There was a big gap. Walmart went to those suppliers and said, you're going to fulfill 98% of our orders on time and in full, or we're
Right.
going to financially penalize you. And so suppliers filled up Walmart shelves, and then, particularly, independent retailers, but smaller competitors, you were sitting there with, no paper towels, no whatever, on their shelves. And this dynamic goes on, even today, even in the absence of shortages. And you can see it in other ways. For example, UNFI, which is a natural foods distributor, primary supplier to like natural foods co-ops, food co-ops, and also Whole Foods, which is of course owned by Amazon.
They sell hippies.
They sell hippies.
Yeah.
What I hear from people in that sector, among the small co-op grocers, is that that truck will go to Whole Foods first, and if at the end of that driver's shift they haven't reached the natural food store, it's like tough luck. And so there's this like phenomenon of stockouts, as they call it, like empty shelves, empty products, products not on shelves, all across these small natural food stores that compete with Whole Foods, mainly because the deal is that Amazon gets service first, and everybody else gets the short end of the straw. So everybody saw this in COVID, and it was, in terms of Walmart, it was such a useful moment because it really just like very concretely illustrated the kind of power that they had over suppliers. And so it was a great moment of kind of wake up about the dynamics, and that, okay, well, if they're denying competing grocers supply, then this idea that they're also charging them higher prices and otherwise harming them, makes a lot of sense.
Sure. So a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of pricing games on the supplier side, and then how they filter over to the consumer. But are there more direct games that are being played in terms of pricing with the consumer? I know that Walmart, I think a year ago or so, moved to digital shelf tags, electronic shelf tags. And are there anything that you're seeing in terms of consumers at Walmart maybe getting shafted?
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of these big grocery chains sort of trying to experiment with the idea of digital shelf tags, which is the idea that they can change prices maybe as rapidly as you see pricing algorithms change prices, say at Amazon or other online stores. And we already know from sort of growing body of evidence that the way that Amazon uses pricing algorithms results in higher prices for people, that those algorithms and that rapid fluctuation is designed to kind of, increase profits and prices for the company at the expense of shoppers. And so we see that Walmart and others trying to figure out how to get in on that same game. And of course, through, in some cases through loyalty programs and the like, we see big chains trying to figure out how to do personalized pricing, where they can, sort of figure out based on all this data they have about you, whether you're susceptible to paying a higher price, maybe because of something about you demographically, or maybe there's something about the moment in which you're buying that product that they feel like they are able to exploit. But it's this world where there is no posted price. There is no like clear way to even discern if the price that you're getting is a fair price. And Americans hate this. Absolutely. I mean, the polling is overwhelming. And yet corporate America is, rapidly driving down this road, and it waits to be seen whether policymakers are going to be aggressive enough in responding.
Yeah. Uh, okay. Um, so why do you think it's so important to have the window into corporate decision making that you were able to unfurl by having this now defunct uh, lawsuit public?
Yeah, I mean, all of this stuff is like it exists in secrecy. Like nobody, like you can talk to people in the grocery industry and everyone sort of knows that it's going on, but there's not, you can, it's hard to come across hard numbers, hard facts in order to support that evidence because the companies involved don't want anyone to know. I mean, Pepsi and Walmart want to keep this deal a very secret. And so having this out in the light of day is really important to demonstrate what's going on. And, I should say, like, it's, we haven't talked a lot about uh, independent grocers. And you mentioned, Matt, the distributor that you had. So I know you all have kind of covered
Mm-hmm.
this in previous podcasts, but there are lots of grocery stores out there who, and other kinds of independent retailers, because this isn't just about grocery, but there are a lot of grocery
Mm-hmm.
retailers out there who are hanging on. Often they're the only grocery store in their community, meaning that when they close, that's a place that's going to become a food desert. Um, and they're often serving people who can least afford to pay more. And like this is a matter of like life and death for those businesses if we don't enforce this law. And there's only so long that they can wait. So the stakes of Robinson Patman enforcement are very real and concrete, and they have to do with like whether your neighborhood or your community can sustain a grocery store and can have prices that you can afford. And so
Yeah.
we can't go on sort of forever like this without continuing to see the problems that this is generating get worse and worse.
So I just want to read something which from a House committee report, because I just love the dork stuff. But this was from August, and it was the appropriations, so the funding for the FTC. And I just want to, this is to testament to your work. So this is in a Republican Congress. The the committee reminds the FTC of its existing statutory authorities to promote competition and ensure all market participants are treated fairly. And they are talking about the food, pharmacy, and retail sectors. So this is very much the House of Representatives telling the FTC, "Hey,
We
start.
noticed.
We noticed what happened."
Right.
So I think
Right.
that's
When was that? I didn't catch the date.
so that was in August.
In August. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what, I mean, Ferguson's dissent and like dismissing of this case as like a, some Democratic partisan whatever thing he said. What the actual truth is that the there's a huge political constituency for enforcing this law that is small town grocers and their customers across red and rural America. I mean, it's also an urban issue, but I
Yeah.
mean, this is,
I mean, these are rich Republicans. Like, just to be straightforward, like if you own a small chain of independent grocery stores in a rural area, you're like a booster for the like college football. Like you're not like super rich, but you're making money, right? So this is like
Right.
the congressman, you might be the congressman. So it's not part like the point is it's not partisan here at all. Anyway,
But
yeah,
but also it speaks to this broader movement against unfair pricing that we're starting to
yeah.
see. And I feel like each revelation, so it's this, but it's also the revelations we saw around Instacart, where they were
yeah.
doing differential pricing. Every time like a Wendy's or somebody says, oh, we're going to do surge pricing, and the backlash that they get, does it seem like there's this building kind of movement towards a public reckoning against this kind of thing?
I sure hope so. I mean, and it really illustrates like how, regular people think about how the economy should work and what they value, like fairness, clearness, that sort of thing, versus like sort of what the elite economics kind of arguments are about, how, algorithmic dynamic pricing is a good thing. We hear that's,
Right.
it helps allocate stuff
Right.
or something or
It's
other.
efficient allocation of resources.
Right,
I can't
right.
believe that you would be against that or anyone would be against that.
Right. and real people are like, no, not at all. Like this just is not, that is not true. And the reality is that we want a system that's fair and transparent. And we don't see that at all. I mean, we had another report come out in December about Amazon's moves to, it's become like the source of supplies for a lot of school districts and cities, municipal governments across the country. They're buying their office supplies and classroom materials and so on through Amazon, and they're signing these contracts, these procurement contracts that specify dynamic pricing. And so they are just paying like whatever the price is on Amazon when they log on. And we found like these just crazy differences and really inflated prices that a lot of these districts are paying because they happen to log on and they paid, $38 for a 12 pack of markers. It's just, I hope that there is a huge backlash coming.
So last question for you, which is, economists, I think what we're up against is not that people like these kinds of pricing games. We're up against this theory price comes from supply and demand and these natural forces, right? It's just it is ordained by God. And what we're really trying to convince people of is that pricing is about power.
Yeah.
And I think normal people, not to fetishize the normal people, but people I think kind of get that this is about power. But elites are still stuck in economist brain, right? Where they're just sort of like, well, what do you mean? I mean, a contract? I had no idea there are contracts. No, I thought this was supply and demand curves. What do you notice about kind of elites and how they think about supply and demand curve? Is this notion that in fact pricing is about power? Is that getting into the elite world? Is the elite world still in the Jason Furman progressive case for Obama for Walmart? Sorry, Freudian slip. For the progressive case for Walmart. Where are we in terms of persuading? Basically rarely is the question asked, is our elites learning?
I hope so. I mean, in the longer running, if I look back and I think about 10 years ago, I feel like, anybody who was arguing that view of how the supply and demand, and that we have the big companies are just responding to supply and demand and everything's all great, that sort of elite economist view, consolidation is good, we should push manufacturing overseas, all those kinds of ideas were like dominant to the point of no one could really there was no space in the conversation for any other perspective. And today there is quite a bit of space. I mean, you certainly see any number of policy leaders who dispute those notions. And I do think that there's starting to be, we saw it with the election in November, where, you see people running on, no, we're going to cut utility rates. We are going to take aggressive action on these issues. We're not going to be following kind of like a theoretical idea of how the economy works, but we're actually going to be responding to real people's needs with with actual policy tools that address them. And I hope that's the direction that we continue to go in, but it's hard to say.
Well, great. Stacy Mitchell, co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, director of its Independent Business Initiative. Thank you so much for being on Organized Money.
Thank you. I love the podcast. It was fun to be here.
Organized money.
So I'll just tell you about my journey into this space, which is,
tell us your journey, man.
Tell us my journey. I was one of the clueless elites that Stacy talked about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I did very well in economics, maybe 25 years ago. Something. I'm old, trying to disguise it, but I did very well in economics. I thought supply and demand curves are right. I thought price was this natural thing. And I think the power of this framework that just says it's all inevitable. It's not even good or bad. All of this stuff just happens. And these are forces that are beyond our control. There's nothing we can do about it. That to me is kind of the main thing that this scandal is exposing, that none of that is true, that these are all just choices that we make about what kinds of contracts to sign, and that pricing is not only not just solely determined by supply and demand curves, which, there's some utility to looking at supply and demand curves, but also there are contracts and there are lots of different kinds of pricing and there's power and all of these things that they're never considered by people like Jason Furman and those
Yeah.
inevitabilists. So
A-
that's what I sort of took away.
Yeah. In some way, it's a return to the past, right? I mean, you wrote a piece fairly recently at the big newsletter about how price tags, a common price that you walk into a store and pay, are a relatively new phenomenon. They came out of the late 19th century. John Wanamaker in Philadelphia and kind of associated with the Quaker movement.
The only good thing ever to come out of that city.
Oh, come on,
I
man.
hate the Eagles.
Yeah, well,
Just
we're
alcoholics who
gonna
support the
have
Eagles.
to go Birds. We're gonna have to talk about that later. Go Finns too, right? But so it was John Wanamaker who came up with. He said, okay, actually, people will appreciate if you come into a store and you're not having to haggle for how much it's going to cost, and the sales clerk isn't sizing you up and looking at what clothes you wear and
Right.
thinking, oh, you can obviously afford more, so I'll charge you more. The idea of basic fairness in pricing is not that old. And so, even though it seems like that's the way it's always been, there's always been this sort of push against it to make pricing more of about power dynamics.
Well, it's contested. I mean, actually, the not to be argumentative, it's very old because you can go back to Aristotle and Aquinas, the idea of fairness in pricing. But the point is it's a political ideal and it's a fight, and it always has been a fight. The
Right.
price tag is the modern manifestation of that, but it isn't just supply and demand curves. It's not inevitable that all this stuff happens. And so, it just we think of it as kind of natural. And this is the kind of part that I talked about it's so fundamentally baked into American culture that we all like watch the game show The Price is Right with just the
Right.
assumption that it was natural, that just there is a retail price for something. But what we're seeing with all of these different pricing games and the collapse of that legal regime is that was actually contingent upon a set of laws
Right.
and business activities that were not unique but constructed by a political ideology where people believed in equality, and that equality
Right.
was manifested by people paying the same price for the same good.
Right. And it also is based in the fact that we used to have common squares and common spaces to actually have engage in commerce. And now that we're all isolated behind, our computers or our phones, and that's where we're doing commerce, it's much easier for companies to break that relationship and to personalize prices and what have you.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as a legal and political shift. I mean, we could have there just as we are atomized and isolated, we could just as easily use the same technology to create common collective action to ensure that pricing is
Right.
is fair. But what we just the law and the but this gets to and maybe we should do an
Right.
episode about the emergence of AI. I think Google had a really important announcement, and I don't want to get too
Yeah.
deep into it, but we are headed we're headed towards a very scary dystopian place around pricing if we don't get control over
Right.
the centralized entities that really control price in America at this point, which is really Google and Amazon. Google
Right.
and
And you're
Amazon.
referring to like bots buying stuff on the behalf of people and, those bots having relationships with the retailers and then preferencing various places to shop. And like it really could be dystopian. But I do think that there is so much pushback that every time one of these things comes out, whether it's Instacart or whether it's this Pepsi case,
Or
there
Wendy's.
is or Wendy's, there's so much public anger and I do think we could see it's a contested space, as you said. We could see it go right in the direction of dystopia, but we could also see a real movement build for fair pricing.
That's right. And ultimately it is up to us. And I think the fact that people are angry is far more important than we give it credit for. Because what I was talking about is sort of the technological possibilities, but the technological possibilities are bounded by the politics. And when
Right.
people get mad, they got mad about the Wendy's thing, and the CEO of Wendy's was just said, "Oh, just kidding. I'm not doing dynamic pricing."
Right.
and maybe they'll try to do it, but the Instacart people, like their stock dropped. The FTC announced an investigation when the report. So public, just it's hard to. What's weird to think about this, but you, the listener, getting mad in your own head actually makes a difference. Like
Right.
weirdly,
It plays a role.
It does
It plays
matter.
a real role. Yeah,
And the fact
absolutely.
that we've been silent about pricing for 50 years is why pricing has gone crazy. So
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
it is what it is.
All right, great. Well, we will be back next week with another episode of Organized Money.
Organized money.